Good evening. Everybody hear me all right? I'm Diane Kresh, Director of Arlington County Library. Delighted to see such a nice crowd for a very specialized topic this evening, but certainly a very timely one. Some of you may be aware that Arlington has convened a commemorative task force in honor of our involvement in World War I, aka the Great War, because it wasn't supposed to happen again, but Margaret will explain all of that as we get into the program this evening. A couple of housekeeping things. If you've got a phone, please turn it off. This will be taped, so when we get into the question and answer period, Vicki will hand microphones. And I know that can be annoying, but it really helps with the audio preservation of the program, and then other people have access to it. Margaret will speak around 40 minutes and then invite questions. We do have one-page books here with us this evening if people want to buy a copy of the book. For many, many years, I worked at the Library of Congress, and I can attest to not only the depth of the collections, but the uniqueness and the excitement that I used to get when I worked in the special collections and saw the kind of rarities that the library's been able to collect. I believe it has probably the single most collection relating to World War I in the world. So I think you're in for a real treat this evening with Margaret's book. Margaret is a senior writer-publisher with the publishing office at the Library of Congress and the author of a few more books. And of course, let's see, Library of Congress, World War II Companion and the Civil War, American Civil War, 365 Days, and also an illustrated history of Maxfield Parrish. So you're multidimensional. But tonight we're here to talk about World War I. So without further pauses, please welcome Margaret Wagner. You good? Okay.
Now, can everybody hear me? Sort of? Good. I'm a selected short subject, so I never know where to put the microphone. So thank you to Diane, and thank you to One More Page Books for being here. And it's a particular joy for me to be at this library. Of course, I love libraries. In my checkered career, I have worked at 2 of them. I was Ms. Ready Reference at the Rockford, Illinois Public Library briefly after I graduated from college. And of course now I have the great joy to work at the nation's library, your library, the Library of Congress. But I have a particular feeling for the Arlington libraries because I'm a longtime Arlingtonian. And for some of the first years that I lived here, I lived right across the street at 1020 North Quincy Street. So this was my second home. So I'm home again. So it is, and since I'm talking about libraries, by the way, and since Diane had mentioned, I will get this right, since Diane had mentioned that Arlington, like many other local venues are celebrating or commemorating the American participation in World War I. I'd just like to point out and invite you to the Library of Congress, which is also commemorating World War I. And some of you have picked up this Library of Congress magazine commemorative edition. I could only stuff so many issues in my little carrying case. And that will tell you a little bit about not only the war, but the library's collections, and also about the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress, which was started in the year 2000 to collect reminiscences and artifacts of American veterans from World War I to the present. And right now it has about 100,000 collections of veterans, a little over 300 of which are World War I veterans. And the library is also has mounted a major exhibition, Echoes of the Great War, which will extend through January of 2019. And so please do come and participate, take a look at the exhibition. It's going to go through 3 rotations, which means that they'll be changing out items. So by the end of that, there will have been about 700 items from the library's really matchless World War I collections on display for you to see up close and personal. So getting back to America and the Great War, the book and the era it describes. The era, I strongly believe, is one that is crucially important, not just for the understanding of world history and the changes that have brought us here to where we are at present day, but it's also very important to the understanding of American history. In this era, Americans were brought face to face with some very fundamental questions. Among them, what role or roles should the United States play in the world? What are the rights and what are the obligations of American citizens and aspiring citizens, especially in times of national emergency? What powers should the federal government have to deal with domestic problems and reforms, and also to cope with war-related crises? The book weaves together political, social, and military history. So what I have tried to do is crowd as many images as I could into this PowerPoint presentation. And as we go through it, I will touch on as many of the aspects of the war and the people that you would meet in the book. And I'm going to have an exercise in hand-eye coordination here, so bear with me. There. If you go to the sections of Belgium and France today that were 100 years ago what was known as the Western Front, the area where the vast majority of American soldiers fought, you will see many remnants of trench lines, many scars on the landscape still, and many archaeological evidences of the Great War, including this medical bunker. You'll also see ample evidence of the great cost of this amazingly bloody war in human lives and in human anguish. All the World War I cemeteries there are impeccably well cared for. But you can see in the relative size and coloration of the tombstones there the outcome of the war and the emotional reverberations from it. In France, a number of the memorials commemorate the American contribution to the war during its relatively short but very important time of belligerence, only 19 months. However, what did World War I mean to the United States from the very beginning to the aftermath of the war? That is what America and the Great War examines. The prologue, I was pushing the wrong button. The prologue to the book examines what the United States was like in the 2 years leading up to the war. It was a country of some 92 million citizens. The lower 48 states had just been completed. Arizona and New Mexico had just been added to the country in 1912. So some Americans were thinking, in the words of a popular song of the day, "Oh boy, oh joy, where do we go from here?" It was a boisterous, entrepreneurial nation. It was a nation of immigrants. It had a tiny army. for the United States did not wish to be a militaristic nation. It figured an army of 128,000, actually in 1912 it was fewer than 100,000 men, would be adequate to take care of the defense of the nation. The prologue looks at the four-person contest that brought Woodrow Wilson to the presidency. And it looks at the belief that was prevalent among forward-looking Europeans and Americans, including Wilson's Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, that the era of major military conflicts was over, that the developed nations, if you will, of the world were so intertwined in finances, in trade, in many ways, that there would be no sense to have a major war. There could be no clear victory. Arbitration, people believed, was the wave of the future. It was also the apex of the progressive era. As Woodrow Wilson said in his first inaugural address, the great government we loved has too often been made use of for private and selfish purposes, and those who used it had forgotten the people. So progressives, Wilson and the progressives who supported him were dealing with major problems. They were determined to reform some of these problems, some of which will sound very familiar to us today. Great concern over income inequality, great concern over regulating the giant conglomerates called business trusts. It was also a time of great distress in labor relations as people in textile factories, in mines, and all over the United States were trying to get proper working conditions. So that is a thread. These are threads that also find their way through the book. Another problem that the progressives address, but which white progressives, very much including Woodrow Wilson, preferred to ignore, was the country's troubled racial relations. The portrait at the upper right here is of the outspoken civil rights activist William Monroe Trotter, who was the spokesman that so offended President Wilson on the second visit to the White House. He led two delegations, one in November of 13 and one in November of 1914, asking the Wilson administration to rescind the segregation of the federal workforce, which Wilson had imposed when he got into office. He had so offended the president that the president effectively declared him persona non grata. He would never get to the White House again. Despite the nation's and Wilson's preferred concentration on domestic improvement, Americans absolutely could not avoid foreign relations concerns. The most immediate and pressing in the spring of 1914 was the ongoing revolution in Mexico, the southern neighbor in which 40,000 Americans lived at that time and in which Americans had significant financial holdings. Wilson dispatched U.S. troops to Veracruz in April 1914. They were still there when papers reported the assassination of the Austro-Hungarian heir to the throne, Franz Ferdinand, and his wife Sophie on June 28th. Similar political assassinations had occurred in Europe before without major international consequences. Few Americans, actually few Europeans for that matter, suspected that these murders would be the small-ish spark that would ignite a full-scale European war. Even before the formal declarations of war that occurred in Europe in early August, the war affected the United States. There were many Europeans were heavily invested in American industry, and they began, as the war got closer, they began cashing in their stocks for American gold. As a result, the government became very concerned, and the American stock markets closed down at the end of July 1914 and did not open again for months. Trade with Europe came to a temporary but extremely costly halt, exacerbating an ongoing recession. And the 16th Amendment to the Constitution had just been passed or ratified in 1912, bringing us all the delightful income tax that we're so aware of these days. But hardly anybody was paying income tax at this time. So the government was mostly supported by tariffs from trade. So this was a terrible thing. 130,000 Americans were now trapped in Europe. They had been traveling there, they had been studying there. All the banks were shut down, transportation was unavailable. So the book goes into the story. It's a very nice story, one of my favorites in the book, of the rescue mission, the government and private sector rescue mission that brought all 130,000 back by the end of October. This young gentleman here commemorates the fact that 10,000 of those people trapped were school teachers who were off studying school systems of other countries. And he's looking at an accurate reflection of newspaper headlines that were saying, well, it looks like school's going to have to be delayed until these teachers get back. And he's saying, to hear everybody talk, you'd think this here war was a bad thing. But this here war was a bad thing. Americans immediately, the American government immediately declared neutrality, and Woodrow Wilson soon embarked on a quest to guide the warring nations to the conference table to find a negotiated settlement for the war. And Wilson was a man with a sense of mission. He felt very strongly that the United States, as the greatest and most powerful, the largest neutral nation, and one with an exceptional democratic history, it would be the perfect instrument to guide the belligerents to the conference table. In October, a dent in perfect U.S. neutrality occurred when the Wilson administration allowed private U.S. banks to provide substantial loans to belligerent countries. This was not against international or American law, but for the first weeks of the war, the Wilson administration had thought strict neutrality meant no loans to anybody that was fighting. But in the event, all this money that was loaned out came quickly back to the United States, so that by 1915, the recession that had been going on in 1913, 1914 was over, and the United States was well on its way to becoming a principal world economic power. Most of the monies loaned, of course, went to the Allies, but at the beginning, some also went to the Central Powers. The book also traces the beginning and progress of an unprecedented outpouring of American aid to war victims, initially on both sides of the conflict. Herbert Hoover, who was in 1914 a businessman living in England, became internationally renowned when he headed the Commission for Relief in Belgium, which started up in October of 1914, and over the course of the war sent tons and tons of food and medicine and clothing to the people of German-occupied Belgium and France. In 1915, when Americans heard first from the American ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, Henry Morgenthau Sr., and then from American missionaries in the Middle East, that Ottoman soldiers were massacring Armenians and that many people in the Middle East were facing starvation because of the war being waged in their area. Another great effort started up. It eventually became known as Near East Relief, and that rivaled the Commission for Relief in Belgium in its size. But all over Europe, Americans who lived in Europe were setting up hospitals and ambulance corps. There was such a great outpouring. And the book also touches on the experiences of some of the American men who flouted U.S. neutrality to join belligerent fighting units, almost all of whom fought for the Allies. By the end of 1914, expectations for a short war were dashed. There always seem to be expectations for a short war, and they're almost always dashed. The land war became an industrial age nightmare that introduced a host of new and improved, if you can call them that, weapons, organized air forces, the flamethrower, lethal gases. Those last two were introduced in 1915 by the Germans. Massed heavy artillery, massed machine guns. All of this made the war a nightmare no one had ever anticipated. It was the maritime war, however, that most immediately concerned Americans. The Allied surface navy blockade of the Central Powers, which, as it expanded, violated the accepted rules of war for blockading, was a near constant irritant to Americans. But it was an irritant that was generally offset by the incoming Allied war orders. The U-boat counter-blockade on which the Germans embarked in February 1915, and for which there were no applicable rules of war, since this is the first war in which there was organized submarine warfare, that counter-blockade put American lives in peril. The first major crisis came in May 1915, when 123 Americans were among the 1,198 people who died when a U-boat sank the British liner Lusitania without any warning. From then until April 1917, that's almost 2 years, President Wilson, still determined to bring both sides to the negotiating table, still determined that America would remain neutral, walked a very challenging diplomatic tightrope while facing increased political pressures at home. The American peace movement remained very strong. The preparedness movement, which was primarily concerned with defending the United States rather than intervening in the war, that preparedness movement was growing. It continued to grow gradually and sometimes by leaps and bounds after the Lusitania. From first Germany at the very beginning of the war and very shortly thereafter Britain produced huge amounts of propaganda during the war, and a lot of it was aimed directly at Americans. David Lloyd George was a cabinet minister at the beginning of the war, and he's up on this slide because he was the minister that convinced people to establish a propaganda organization known as Wellington House. And that Wellington House had a very special department devoted to swaying American opinions. By late 1915, American papers began publishing verified details of German and Austro-Hungarian espionage in the United States. And that ranged from really nasty stuff like placing small bombs on ships that were taking materials to the Allies, to subsidizing, for instance, German funds purchased a munitions plant in Connecticut to make sure that none of the munitions produced there would go to the Allies. And they also subsidized just a few American publications, including one called The Fatherland, which was edited by German-American George Verreck. Reports also confirmed that German agents were seeking to increase the turmoil in Mexico to distract American attention and resources and lessen the possibility that the United States would join the Allies. To decrease the Mexican turmoil, in October 1915, the Wilson administration turned away from Pancho Villa, who had seemed to Americans at the very first to be the strongest faction and the one most likely to end the turmoil, and it recognized the government of Venustiano Carranza, and this, of course, infuriated Pancho Villa. In January 1916, the American Review of Reviews had this to say about the war. War for Europe is meaning devastation and death. For America, a bumper crop of new millionaires and a hectic hastening of prosperity revival. And this was accurate. 1916 would be another financially profitable year. However, pressures from beyond U.S. borders were increasing. The U-boat danger, which waned and waxed, waned again in March, when for the second time, the Germans pledged that their submarines would abide by the rules of surface naval warfare. They would not sink merchant vessels without prior warning and without seeing to the safety of the passengers and crew. This was restricted submarine warfare. That same month, March, Pancho Villa and his guerrilla band raided Columbus, New Mexico, killing 17 Americans and infuriating every one of their countrymen. General John J. Pershing led several thousand troops into Mexico on a months-long punitive expedition. And in that photo, General Pershing is right there, fourth from the left, and the gentleman lurking behind him is a young staff officer by the name of George Patton, who, when he went over to Europe, would become fascinated by these new devices called tanks. The punitive expedition did not find Villa. It did increase tensions with the Carranza government, and it did demonstrate how very ill-prepared the U.S. Army was for participation in a major conflict. Meanwhile, Britain also incurred American anger when, despite U.S. pleas for mercy, it executed the leaders of the Easter Rising in Ireland. And again, when the British government issued a blacklist of more than 80 American firms and individuals suspected of doing business with the Central Powers. In Europe, the horrors of war seemed to be growing exponentially, and 1916 saw the months-long battles of Verdun and the Somme. Americans, individual Americans, were serving in the ranks of the Allied armies at both these battles. A very unique individual, the African-American Eugene Bullard, who had joined the Foreign Legion, was fighting at Verdun and was severely wounded. He would go on to become a pilot in the French Air Forces. And Alan Seeger, an American poet, who had just completed what his most famous poem about a month before, I Have a Rendezvous with Death, was killed in the first days of the Battle of the Somme. Americans were also flying over the trenches at those battles. 1916 saw the official debut of a discrete American flying unit in the French forces, the soon-to-be famous Lafayette Escadrille. At home, preparedness forces were gaining ground, now with the wholehearted assistance of President Wilson, who said in one speech, "All the rest of the world is on fire, and our own house is not fireproof." So to begin fireproofing the House, that year Congress passed a Naval Appropriations Act which called for a massive expansion of the U.S. Navy by the year 1925. It also passed the National Defense Act, which allowed for an increase in the U.S. Army all the way up to 175,000 men, and also strengthened federal control over the National Guard, and for the first time in American history allowed the president to deploy the National Guard overseas for the period of an emergency. May 27th of this year, President Wilson also announced a major shift in U.S. foreign policy, declaring the U.S. a full partner in international affairs. Americans had been involved internationally, of course, ever since there became a United States. Our businessmen and missionaries were all over the world. We were very interested in world trade. But now the war was teaching Wilson that we could not remain totally aloof from what Americans before had thought of as the political squabbles between foreign nations. We are participants, whether we would or not, in the life of the world, Wilson said. What affects mankind is inevitably our affair. While all this was happening, members of the American Union Against Militarism were touring American cities, making speeches against what they saw as the American drift toward European-style militarism, which in their view could only bring the United States to the kind of disaster that was occurring in Europe. AUAM speakers were accompanied by a giant papier-mâché dinosaur named Jingo, which was identified as being all armor plate and no brains. 1916 was also a presidential election year, Wilson versus the very respected Republican Charles Evans Hughes. And that race became a very close one, and not just because Wilson still refused to endorse a constitutional amendment for women's suffrage. He said he believed that was a matter for the states, and in fact, a number of U.S. states by this time had given women the right to vote, but there was no national, no constitutional amendment. Once he was reelected, and it took 3 days after the election for him to be sure it was that close. Once he was reelected, Wilson turned again to diplomacy. First, in December of 1916, he sent a note to all the belligerent leaders asking them to state specifically their war aims. And he managed to offend both sides in the note by saying that up to that time, the war aims as they had stated them seemed to be the same. In January of 1917, he delivered what came to be known as his Peace Without Victory speech. In this speech, he asked whether this war was, quote, a struggle for a just and secure peace or only for a new balance of power, end quote. And he predicted accurately, as it turned out, that if one side gained military victory over the other, that would mean, quote, peace forced upon the loser, and it would leave a sting, a resentment, a bitter memory upon which terms of peace would rest not permanently, but only as upon quicksand. Neither side was in the mood for peace without victory. By this time, however, too much blood had been spilled. In fact, when Wilson was delivering his speech, by that time, Germany had already decided to return and return forcefully to unrestricted submarine warfare. All belligerent and neutral ships encountered in wide swaths of the Atlantic Ocean and Mediterranean Sea would be sunk without warning. On January 31st of 1917, Ambassador von Bernstorff informed Secretary of State Robert Lansing that unrestricted warfare would start the next morning. Just in case this would be the final straw for the United States and would bring it into the war, the Germans decided to hedge their bets, and Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann sent a coded telegram to the German ambassador in Mexico. And that telegram said that in the event the United States entered the war, the Germans invited the Mexicans to enter into an alliance against the United States, and Germany would support Mexico financially and would also help Mexico get back some of the territory that the United States received after the 1846-1848 Mexican War. That would include the states of Arizona and New Mexico. Of course, when this became common knowledge, it was published in American papers on March 1st, 1917. This did nothing to soften the American mood against the Germans. The German announcement did in fact move the United States to sever diplomatic relations on February 3rd, but it did not immediately push the nation into war. America and the Great War examines the last few weeks of events and debates in Congress and among civilian organizations over whether or not to go to war. And some of the organizations in the United States would divide over the question of war. Socialists, for example, led by Eugene Debs, many socialists decided that their domestic aims would be best served by supporting the American war effort. Mr. Debs, however, was one of the socialists that remained adamantly against the war. He felt that the United States was going to war for all the wrong reasons, and in fact, he would be sent to prison for his views during the war. So the suffrage movement also divided. Most suffrage workers also believed that if they cooperated in the war effort, if they worked to support the war effort, that would further their quest for a constitutional amendment. However, there were some more radical ones, headed by Alice Paul, who wanted to keep their eyes on that prize that they had been searching for so very long. And so they continued. The suffragettes that were associated with Alice Paul actually started picketing the White House in January of 1917, the first people ever to do that. And Alice Paul would also be sent to prison during the war. The African American community wholeheartedly supported. They wrote the president, spokespersons wrote the president saying that he could count on the loyalty of the African American community. And W.E.B. Du Bois was a chief proponent of supporting the war effort in order to gain more leverage to get to the equality that the African Americans had been searching for so very long. There were some African Americans, however, who did object to supporting the war effort. A. Philip Randolph was one of them. He took a phrase from the April 2nd speech in which President Wilson asked for a declaration of war, that the world must be made safe for democracy, and said in his newspaper, maybe it would be better to make Georgia safe for the Negroes. There is a usurper up there, a non-American. In the middle of March 1917, Americans were almost ecstatic. I mean, you'd be surprised at some of the newspaper accounts when Americans discovered that the first Russian Revolution had taken place in the middle of March, and that deposed Tsar Nicholas, who was the only autocrat leading a nation on the Allied side, and replaced him with a more liberal government that planned to stay in the war with Russia's huge forces, which were at about 6 or 7 million at that time. So this made it a little bit easier for the United States to feel that this was a war defending democracy. Nevertheless, when the vote came in Congress after 2.5 days of grueling debate, 56 legislators voted against a declaration of war. And one of those 56 was Jeannette Rankin, the first woman elected to Congress. This was her very first vote, and she tearfully said, "I want to support my country, but I cannot vote for war." Ms. Rankin was also the only American legislator to vote against American entry into World War II. The book contemplates the many major questions raised by the declaration of war. Would it be necessary to send an army overseas? Or would financial supply and naval assistance be adequate? And for a period of weeks, we thought that would be the United States' major contribution. How large an army would be needed in either event? How would it be raised? How would the war effort be funded? What roles could or should women play? How would U.S. forces coordinate with the larger and more experienced Allied armed forces? It discusses the heated civilian debate over conscription, and there was also a very heated congressional debate over conscription, and the determination to build and maintain a distinct American army rather than to place U.S. soldiers within Allied ranks. And this is a picture of the French commission that came to Washington in April 1917. All the Allied countries sent commissions to the United States. The first two were the British and the French, and they came to see how prepared the United States was for war, and they discovered not very. The French were the most popular because we Americans still remembered how France helped us win independence in the Revolutionary War. General Pershing, there he is again, was, after the commissions helped the Wilson administration decide that a U.S. army was needed overseas, the American Expeditionary Forces was formed, and at its head, there was nothing in it at the moment, but at its head was John J. Pershing, who had just returned in February from the unsuccessful punitive expedition. And that gentleman next to him is Secretary of War Newton Baker, who had been a pacifist before being named to that office, but he proved to be an extremely effective Secretary of War. This gentleman with a distinguished beard over here, Admiral William Sims, was the United States liaison to the Allied Naval Command, and he spent the war months in London. And he helped convince the Allies to institute a convoy system, which was not in place until May of 1917. The book considers pressing questions regarding civil liberty. How much freedom of expression and freedom of information can be allowed even in a proud democracy during a time of crisis? Figures in this debate include George Creel, named in April to head the newly formed Committee on Public Information, and that was to be basically an informational organization that told the American people information that they would need to make good judgments on how the war should proceed. He did not favor, at the beginning, censorship, at least legislated censorship, but there was voluntary censorship that he advocated. The Committee on Public Information took a lot of lessons, however, from Wellington House and even from the German propaganda machine, and by the end of the war, it was itself a full-throated international propaganda machine with agents in Europe as well as all over the United States. Postmaster General Albert Burleson, who had a network of postmasters all over the United States, was given by the Espionage Act passed in June 1917 wide powers to refuse to mail suspect material and wide powers to determine what was suspect. So a lot of material was taken out of the mail, and the way this worked was local postmasters would send complaints to Burleson, who was also looking around and seeing magazines and newspapers that he thought were publishing suspect materials. So there was this great network through the post office. A peace activist and Wellesley College professor Emily Balch spoke against a broadly worded provision in the Espionage Act that restricted freedom of speech rather severely. Her testimony and that of many others who testified against this provision tempered it somewhat, but again, the determination of what should or should not be construed as anti-war or anti-war support was very, very broad. It was also a period of a great deal of vigilantism. Now, the vigilantes there were not actually vigilantes. This was an organization of writers and artists and actors who were organized to support the war effort. But all across the United States, in towns, in states, and nationally, where there was a great organization, I mean a large organization called the American Protective League that worked with the American government, vigilantism was on the rise, and it often resulted in violence. America and the Great War also looks at mobilization expectations and actualities. Overall, the American war effort was an astonishing, I'd almost say miraculous success. An army of 128,000 growing to about 4 million in 19 months, half of those men being transported overseas. But there were epic problems in War Department organization, in manufacturing and distribution of supplies for the American Expeditionary Forces, in transportation, in regulating resources. There were congressional investigations. Senator George Chamberlain, a member of the president's very own political party, became one of the severest critics of the war effort and its failures. We are still unprepared without a definite war program and still without trained men, he roared in a public speech in December 1917. He raised presidential hackles by suggesting the American war effort be directed not by the president or not by the War Department, but by a war cabinet of 3 distinguished citizens of private ability. This, of course, did not happen, and gradually, though problems never disappeared, they were reduced to manageable size. In November 1917, a second Russian Revolution brought the Bolsheviks to power, and the Bolsheviks immediately declared an armistice that allowed Germany to transfer combat-hardened divisions to the Western Front. More were transferred after the Bolsheviks signed the Brest-Litovsk Treaty in early March 1918. By the 3rd week in March 1918, as U.S. forces, still requiring training, were very slowly arriving, but were not present in sufficient numbers to come anywhere near to tipping the scales. At that time in March, German forces on the Western Front outnumbered Allied troops by about 2 to 1. On March 21st, General Erich Ludendorff launched a massive 5-stage offensive, and the first big blow sent Allied troops with some very ill-prepared Americans in training mixed in, reeling backwards. At one point in the line, they sent them back 40 miles. In the U.S., this frightening news sparked measures to get doughboys, or Sammies, they were known as both, to Europe at a much faster pace, many with very little training. It also sparked an upsurge in vigilantism and questionable actions by combinations of local officials and so-called agents of vigilance societies. March saw the first of the so-called slacker raids, general detention of any man who wasn't carrying his draft registration card to be held without recourse until it was determined he wasn't a draft dodger. And in some of these sweeps, hundreds, even thousands of men were swept up out of theaters, off the streets, and held in pens or stuffed into jails for days, occasionally weeks on end. And it turned out that approximately 90 or 95% of the men who were caught in these nets were not draft dodgers. It's probable that the bad news from the Western Front also helped pass the Sedition Act in May of 1918, legislation that was so out of tune with American traditions of freedom of expression that it was repealed shortly after the war. America and the Great War tells of stateside military training and the further training doughboys needed once they got to France. It addresses the very different treatment accorded the nation's white and black soldiers, including the two black combat divisions, the 92nd, which served very unhappily under American command, and the understrength 93rd, which fought with distinction and great valor under French command. It tells of significant American battle action, including Seicheprey, Cantigny, Bellewood, Chateau-Thierry, the French-led En-Marne offensive, and the two major U.S.-led offensives, Saint-Mihiel in early September 1918, and the four-stage Meuse-Argonne offensive that lasted from late September to the end of the war. It provides glimpses of the experiences of individuals, some of whom, like future World War II Army Chief of Staff and post-World War II Secretary of State George Marshall, were very familiar. Others are relatively unknown. General Pershing, called the much-decorated Samuel Woodville, the most outstanding American soldier of World War I. John Lang was one of 300 men of the U.S. 6th Engineers, completely untrained in combat, who were caught in that first wave of the March 1918 German offensive. He and his men gamely joined with British units to fight their way out. 26 of them were killed during this effort. Born in Scotland, Lang proudly became an American citizen shortly after the war. The book also follows 4,000 American troops to freezing Archangel in the north of Russia, where they engaged in some combat with Bolshevik troops. And it follows 9,000 American troops to Vladivostok in Siberia, where they remained until about 1920. And they did not engage in much combat. They were there to encourage the anti-Bolshevik forces and also to keep their eye on the Japanese troops that were in the area in force. Japan was an emerging competitor with the United States in Asia at that time. It also follows the newly formed U.S. Third Army into Germany after November 11th, when the armistice was signed, to begin occupation duties. And there were American occupation troops in Germany until 1923. The book follows the continuing and amazing war support effort at home and events that affected that war effort, including the sudden appearance of U-boats just off the East Coast that briefly placed the Navy Department in a state of siege from concerned citizens, but it was handled. In late August, the Spanish flu pandemic hit the United States in force, taking an estimated 500,000 American lives before it abated. And of course, the flu was also affecting American troops, all troops in Europe at the same time. The book's epilogue describes the multiple questions and problems resulting from bringing to a rapid halt a war effort that was just beginning to hit its peak efficiency and emotional fervor. It goes abroad with Woodrow Wilson, the first sitting president to travel to Europe, and touches on the vast hopes and bitter disappointments that resulted from that journey. It describes post-war violence in the United States, as labor lost many of its wartime gains in the bloody, strike-torn year of 1919, and African American hopes that their support for the war would advance the cause of equality at home were dashed in a period of racial violence. Bolshevism replaced Prussianism as a prime target of vigilantism as the country went through its first Red Scare. The second one, of course, was after the Second World War. On a much more positive note, Congress finally passed the 19th Amendment to the Constitution after it had languished for many months in the U.S. Senate. Its ratification on August 18, 1920, meant that after decades and decades of struggle, American women finally had the constitutional right to vote. Women were among the voters who heeded Warren Harding's call for a return to normalcy that gained him the White House in 1920. By then, the United States, facing no discernible military threat, had reduced its army to 137,000 men. In other vastly significant ways, however, there could be no turning back. The United States had emerged from the war, the world's leading economic and a premier political power, with demonstrated ability to project military might abroad. It had failed to join the League of Nations, but it was soon working unofficially with League committees to assure continuing peace and stability that were so vital to United States interests. In 1921, the United States organized a successful five-nation naval disarmament conference, the first such conference to take place in Washington. Shortly thereafter, recognizing the country's new position in the world and the truth of Wilson's 1916 statement that we are participants whether we would or not in the life of the world, a number of influential Americans formed the Council on Foreign Relations to be better prepared, as the Council history notes, for significant responsibilities and decision-making in world affairs. As venerable American statesman Elihu Root, one of the Council's founders, stated in 1922, "I suppose that the people of the United States have learned more about international relations within the last 8 years than they had learned in the preceding 80 years. They are, however, only at the beginning of the task." And that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much. If there are questions, if we have time for a few. Okay.
Questions for Margaret then?
Yes.
It's been said that World War I left Europe in the condition that made World War II virtually inevitable. Do you address that in the book?
There is a lot of debate, but clearly World War I left Europe in a mess. And it wasn't just with the armistice or with the signing of the peace treaty. There was really no peace. War broke out between the Greeks and the Turks. There was an ongoing Russian Revolution. The people of the former Austro-Hungarian Empire, which came apart at the seams, it was a very polyglot empire. So by the end of the war, there was Austria, there was Hungary, and many other groups that had been part of that empire were struggling for freedom. There was Poland had reemerged on the map, and there were struggles within Poland to solidify its borders. There was a dividing up of the Middle East. And then there was the Versailles Treaty, which was the chief treaty, the treaty between the Allies and Germany, that created some resentments in Germany, particularly two parts of the treaty, one that made the Germans accept the total responsibility for the war, and the other that declared that they had to pay an enormous amount in reparations. And that created political turmoil within Germany. As it happened in the event, the reparations became less and less, so the Germans did not pay the amount of reparations that the treaty called for. But clearly, that much unrest, that much change in the world, that much radical ripping apart of previous conditions did put in motion some of the waves, some of the things that made it possible for World War II. However, we must not forget that there was also a Great Depression and other things that combined to make the explosion of World War II happen. But it is true, when I was doing some research for a book on World War II, I found two quotes, one from a French officer and one from an American officer, both of whom had attended the negotiations at Versailles, saying, and they both said essentially, this treaty, the Versailles Treaty, is not a treaty, it's a 20-year armistice. And it was signed in 1919, and 20 years later, war broke out in Europe. Any other questions? Aha, many other questions. Yes.
This may be a little off your topic, but over the years I've kind of been in and out of reading about the war, and the American historical perspective focuses, as you have very well, on Europe, Russia. It seems to me, from minor things that there was a whole nother conflict with the Ottoman Empire breaking up, and
Yes.
the area of the world where there's so much going on now was also involved in a conflict. My question is, do you see in your studies any indication that America was involved in that we were trying to do anything in that area, or were we solely focused on Europe?
Well, the Americans, the United States never declared war on the Ottoman Empire. We were never officially at war, but although we were at war with the other Central Powers, so, but we were involved in many ways up till the period of belligerence. Of course, as I said in the presentation, we had diplomats and missionaries there. Many the diplomats, of course, had to come home when we entered the war. But our missionaries stayed there. I think our main involvement when it came to events in the Middle East that carved up the Middle East in the way we see it today came with American representation at the Versailles negotiations. Now, in President Wilson's 14 points, several of the points were pertinent to disappointments after the war. One said that in future there should be open covenants openly arrived at. In other words, there should not be the kind of secret treaties between nations that helped bring World War I into, that helped create World War I. As it happened, though, as the Versailles negotiations continued, a smaller and smaller group of men were making important decisions behind closed doors, so that finally the three people that were making a lot of the important decisions were the President of the United States and the heads of Great Britain and France. And then another 14 points said that people should agree to the governments under which they lived and were going to live. And many petitioners came to Versailles, including a young Indo-Chinese man who had just spent some time in the United States bussing tables, I think was what he did, and he would become known as Ho Chi Minh. And some of the Arab leaders that Lawrence of Arabia had promised autonomy. And they came to Versailles, and most of them were ignored or turned away. So this kind of thing, this is where I think the United States influence had an impact in that area of the world.
My father was a World War I veteran. He was with a division that was at Argonne and Saint-Mihiel, and they ended up the war in Belgium. His conclusion was that we never should have gotten involved in the first place, that it was a mistake. And what he saw in the events of the rest of the century that he experienced never changed his mind about that. Do you think it was possible that we could have stayed out of that war? What do you think that would have looked like if we did not? I mean, we were already massively committed with resources to the Allied side. And finally, would it have been a good thing?
This is an interesting question. It's one of the kinds of questions that make me say it requires a crystal ball with a rear view mirror, and I don't have one of those, but I will say that in no project I've worked on have I thought as much about the what if, and that what if in particular. For there were still a significant number of Americans when we declared war who thought it was the wrong thing to do, who thought the nation was going in it for the wrong reasons. There were also many Americans who believed that we were going to help remake a better world without war. I don't know. I think often that if we'd have stayed out of the war, and if there was a movement during the war to embargo, to not send any supplies to either side ever, which would have meant that we would have stayed in a Great Recession, although during the war we were stepping up, we were taking over the trade routes that had been abandoned by the belligerent nations. So we were stepping up our trade to South America and to Asia. Had we stayed out of the war, it is possible that both sides would have gotten so exhausted that they would eventually have come to the conference table. And what the world, and then the United States could have stepped in to truly help them as a very disinterested nation. But it's impossible to say. You just never know. But I think about it a lot.
It seems like that World War I began with almost a series of dominoes falling. Was there anything that might have been this process at all, as far as because I guess you had people like George and the Kaiser and the Tsar I think were cousins, and but was there
Everybody
anything that
was
could have
cousins.
stopped it, and said, okay, enough?
Well, I'm sure there was a way, because it was a series of stumbles and activating alliances and ethnic bitternesses, actually. The Germans were determined to best the Slavs, the Russians, and the Russians were determined to protect Serbia, which was given some demands by the Austro-Hungarian Empire that they just could not agree to. So at some point, somebody could have blown a whistle. That's where an institution like the League of Nations, people thought, might have stopped the war. But emotions, and there was a great deal of emotionalism as war fever grew. People were afraid of the war. They were shocked by the fact that it seemed to be coming, but there are reports and reports about crowds in the streets of all the belligerent nations singing their national anthem, getting that war fever. And there was a belief at that time, absolutely nobody expected this war to become what it became, the first great industrial war. And there was a feeling that it would, in fact, be a short war. Kaiser Wilhelm told his troops that they would be home before the leaves had fallen from the trees. So this was a kind of adventure. What could have stopped it? I don't know, but whatever could have, didn't.
Just a little curious, your take on a movie I got to watch called The Men Who Build America. You just alluded to it, the industrialization, which was the J.P. Morgans, the Rockefellers, Mellon, Carnegie, etc. Having watched that and listening to what you said, I even hate to bring it up but anyway, the conspiracy theory of the ultra capitalized industrial nation, which you alluded to, is driven by a few men, maybe a few ladies, are all behind closed doors as to the prospect to profit from doing everything that you've spoke about. Do you have any belief in that whatsoever, that a few less than 10 individuals may have been in conference as to who would benefit by supplying, etc.?
I don't think there was any sort of conspiracy. This was really the first war where there was a concerted effort because Americans had seen what total war meant in Europe. They saw that industry and manufacturing had to be closely allied with the war effort, had to be closely attuned to it. So even before we got into the war, Thomas Edison suggested an organization that was formed by Josephus Daniels, the Secretary of the Navy, the Naval Consulting Board, and that allied leaders of business and industry and science with the War Department, with the Navy Department. And one of the first things they did was take a survey all across the United States of the manufacturing and industries that either were making munitions, war material at the time, or could be converted. So, and this was part of the preparedness movement. And again, as we got into the war, the National Council of Defense had a civilian advisory commission. I think most manufacturers, most businessmen, they're certainly aware of profits, they're certainly knowing they're making money, but there was a great deal of patriotism that infused that war effort as well. I never thought about that sort of conspiracy, although a number of Americans were concerned that some of the people who voted against the declaration of war in Congress were saying, we're in it for the almighty dollar, this is wrong. Mm-hmm.
So you were saying this country lost about 500,000 people due to the flu.
Yes.
And I think worldwide, probably more like 20 million
Yes.
people died altogether.
Yes.
Do you think that huge event hastened the end of the war, or did it play any role at all?
That's an interesting question. I have never seen it as hastening the end of the war. It hit its peak certainly in the United States, but I think around the world, it hit its peak in October, late September and October of 1918. And by that time, the Central Powers were falling apart, and Central Powers forces were totally exhausted. Plus, by that time, there were 4 draft registrations in the United States. So by September 12th of 1918, our well of draftees, the well that we could draw from, stood at a fantastical 24 million men. And those men, the Central Powers, the Germans certainly knew that they could not continue fighting if the United States was going to send men through there. So how much a factor the flu was in the ending the war, I don't see it as a very large one. I just see it as a huge tragedy for the planet Earth. Yes.
Hello.
Ooh,
I
sorry.
appreciate the comprehensive overview that you've provided of this period, and you seem to have written other similar books about other wars. Can you talk a little bit about how you got interested in this and how you do your research and pull it all together?
I love to write, I love to research, and I work at the Library of Congress. But I've been interested in history since I was knee-high to a grasshopper, and interested in military history. And the thing that got me interested in military history, and now I see, von Clausewitz said that war is politics or diplomacy by other means. So there inextricably linked. But I got interested in military history because of this war. When I was a little girl, and all I can figure out is that when I was hoovering the bookshelves at home, I got a hold of some of my brother's books about World War I. And as I read more and more about it, I thought of the futility of this war. You know, these months-long battles on the Western Front where men went over the top, knowing that it would be futile, that they'd have to do it, if they survived, they'd have to do it again and again, and no ground was gained. And I started thinking, or asking myself, what gives people the courage to do that? What instills in them the courage to go over the top day after day until they could not do it anymore for one reason or another? This war in particular struck me as a huge, futile conflict, a great mistake. I'm not sure that I have changed my opinion of it, but that's what got me started in my interest in military history. Yes, one more, okay.
The Library of Congress has a large collection of music. Has the library done a CD of songs of World War I, either contemporaneous or somebody sang them later?
I don't believe we've done a CD of World War I songs,
you?
although, well, I'm not the person to talk to about that. But there will be, I think, if you go to the library website, you'll see a whole list of programming that we're going to be doing commemorating World War I. And I believe there's World War I concert on there, as well as films. But they had some delicious music in this war, both the actual songs and soldiers put their own lyrics to some of the songs. If you've ever seen the British film, if you haven't, I recommend it if you're interested in World War I. It's sort of a satirical film. It's called Oh, What a Lovely War. And that is filled with World War I music, including the soldiers' lyrics. It's a great film. So I think with that, I'll wrap up. And again, thank you very much. I've had a great time.